Imagine standing in front of a mirror, tracing the curve of your jawline, the shape of your brow, and sensing the ghost of 1,000 faces behind your own. You have been told a story about those faces, a story of ancient tribes and pure bloodlines, handed down so carefully that it feels like memory itself. But pull the thread, and the story begins to unravel. In the last 2 decades, a quiet revolution has been taking place inside sealed laboratories, where machines read the chemical poetry written inside your cells. And what they read about the genetic history of Serbs is not an echo of old textbooks. It is a map of movement so massive that it reshaped a continent. A map where borders dissolve and new shapes emerge. A single ancient DNA study, recently published, turned the lens on over 130 skeletons buried across the Balkans between the Roman era and the arrival of the Slavs. What those bones whisper is that one of the largest demographic shifts in all of early medieval Europe lives inside you, and that it unites you with neighbors you were taught to see as distant. The story you grew up with is not false, but it is incomplete, and the missing pieces have been lying in the earth for 1,500 years. Stay until the very end, because what you will hear challenges not just a national tale, but the entire idea of where one people ends and another begins. The question is narrow, testable, and until very recently, impossible to answer with certainty. Do modern Serbs descend from a set of ancient, genetically distinct lineages that map cleanly onto today's national categories? Or are they, at the deepest biological level, part of a single, continuously blended population shaped by one overwhelming migration? The difference matters enormously, not for what it says about identity today, but for what it reveals about how history actually moves across the ground. A few years ago, an international team of archaeologists and geneticists set out to solve this riddle by extracting DNA from skeletons that dotted the Balkans like breadcrumbs across a millennium. They sifted through earth at Roman frontier towns, in highland graves, in early Slavic settlements, chasing a statistical pattern they suspected was there. And buried inside their data lies one particular, vivid surprise. A single geographic line that explains more about who you are than any national border ever could. That surprise will not fully land until the very last moment, after we have walked through 6 chapters of evidence, each one pulling us closer to a past that has been hiding in plain sight. For generations, a common education across the former Yugoslav region painted a picture of neatly distinct ancestral streams. You probably learned it yourself. One popular explanation holds that Serbs are the direct descendants of the ancient Illyrians, the proud indigenous people of the Western Balkans who once fought Roman legions and held their own mountain fastnesses. There is genetic truth to an Illyrian connection, but it is only a fraction of the story. The ancient DNA shows that the pre-Slavic populations, which include groups labeled Illyrians, Thracians, and heavily Romanized locals, contributed roughly 40 to 50% of the ancestry of today's Serbs. That is substantial, but it means more than half comes from elsewhere. No modern Balkan nation can claim pure descent from those Iron Age tribes, and to do so is like reading only the first chapter of a long novel. Another deeply rooted assumption says that Serbs are fundamentally a Slavic people, a branch of the great tree that swept into the Balkans during the 6th and 7th centuries, bringing a new language and a new way of life. The image is one of a wave that erased what came before, but the bones tell a different tale. The migration was enormous, it is true, but it did not wipe the slate. The pre-Slavic genetic signal persisted robustly in the same soils, meaning that the ancestors of modern Serbs were not replaced. They were joined, generation after generation, in bedrooms and villages that saw a slow, centuries-long merging. A memorable miniature fact captures it. At the Roman-era site of Viminatium, in present-day Serbia, a skeleton from roughly the 3rd century CE yields a genetic profile that is still visibly present in the genome of a modern Serbian speaker. The past does not disappear, it merely learns a new language. Then there is the widespread belief that Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and Montenegrins represent genetically distinct tribes that arrived separately, each bearing a clear ancestral stamp. You may have heard folk tales of 3 brothers leading 3 groups. The genetic data is blunt on this point. When you look at the genome-wide markers, the South Slavic-speaking populations sit so close to one another that the labels become almost meaningless at the population level. A large research finding, published in Cell in December 2023, concluded that there are no major genetic differences between Serbs and Croats as distinct national groups. The minute variation that does exist is not clustered by nation, but spread along a smooth north to south gradient, like a stain of light fading steadily down the map. And a fourth false answer is the broader assumption that modern ethnic boundaries are a direct fossil of ancient demographic divisions. A careful look at the data shows this cannot be sustained. The Slavic-related genetic component is highest in the northern Balkans, reaching roughly 50 to 60% in present-day Serbia, but it drops to somewhere around 30 to 40% in mainland Greece, and as low as roughly 20% in parts of the Aegean Islands. That slope is the real architecture of the region's DNA. If modern nations lined up with ancient tribes, the numbers would stop abruptly at borders. They do not. They flow across them as if the borders were not there at all. The real setup begins with a single, monumental piece of research. In December 2023, the journal Cell published a study titled A Genetic History of the Balkans from Roman Frontier to Slavic Migrations. It was the work of a large international collaboration, including researchers from the University of Belgrade, Harvard University, and other institutions, and it represented the most ambitious ancient DNA survey of the region ever attempted. The team analyzed genomes extracted from more than 130 individuals who had lived across the Balkans between roughly the 1st century and the 10th century CE. Such a sample size may sound modest compared to modern population studies, but for ancient DNA it is enormous, because the delicate threads of genetic material survive only in the rarest of conditions. A single tooth, a tiny chip of petrous bone, held enough data to crack open a 1,000-year silence. The method, stripped to plain language, works like this. Specialists drill carefully into a bone, extract the powder, isolate short fragments of DNA, and then sequence millions of small markers called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. They do the same for modern populations across the region. Then they use statistical tools to measure how much of the ancient genetic patterns are still circulating in the blood of living people. The question had stayed unsolved for so long because, before this study, ancient Balkan genomes were so sparse that any reconstruction of migration rested on fragments of pottery, ambiguous historical chronicles, and linguistic guesswork. Written sources are contradictory. Some Byzantine authors describe a great flood of Slavs, while others barely mention it. Without the genetic evidence, two perfectly reasonable historians could construct two completely opposite narratives. The researchers themselves, when they first saw the raw output, reportedly experienced a moment of surprise, as the data assembled itself not into separate national clusters, but into a continuous geographic sweep, with time as the only true wedge. What they found reshapes how we must tell the story, and it starts with the most distant echo they could recover. The first chapter reveal is the genetic footprint of the pre-Slavic world. Long before the word Serb was ever written, the Balkans were a dense mosaic of Illyrian, Thracian, and Romanized communities. When the ancient DNA from Roman-era skeletons is compared to modern Serbs, it becomes clear that this older stratum is still there, underpinning roughly 40 to 50% of contemporary ancestry. A surprising side fact emerges. The same pre-Slavic signature appears at almost identical levels in Croats, Bosniaks, and Montenegrins. There is no such thing as a uniquely Serbian Illyrian inheritance. It is a shared basement layer across the Western Balkans. Picture a single skeleton being lifted from the black earth near the Danube. The archaeologist's trowel scrapes gently against the yellow of a femur, the summer sun hot on the back of her neck. The soil smells of old charcoal and damp clay. This person lived under Roman rule, perhaps spoke Latin, maybe worshipped Mithras. His genome sits on the lab bench 14 centuries later, and it tells you that he is not unique to one modern nation. He is a common ancestor to many. Two percentages face each other, roughly 40% pre-Slavic ancestry in Serbs versus the same roughly 40% in their neighbors. That number refuses to divide along political lines. And yet this is only a foundation, because a much louder genetic voice is about to speak. The second chapter is the migration itself, and its scale is staggering. Beginning around the 6th century CE, a movement of people genetically similar to today's Slavic-speaking Eastern Europeans poured into the Balkan Peninsula. It was not a single event, but a rolling tide that lasted generations. The genetic signal it left behind follows a strict north to south gradient, and in present-day Serbia, it reaches roughly 50 to 60% of the total ancestry, a contribution larger than any other single ancient group on its own. An unexpected detail is that this gradient runs with such mathematical smoothness that you can almost draw it with a ruler from the Pannonian Plain to the Peloponnese. Imagine a late autumn evening in the 7th century. A small group shelters at the edge of a dark forest, the fire crackling as a child with pale hair sleeps against her mother's woolen cloak. The mother's language is an early Slavic tongue, the same linguistic ancestor from which modern Serbian will one day grow. That child carries a particular Y chromosome lineage, a branch of haplogroup R1a, which will become one of the key markers of this migration. Millennia later, that lineage still hums in the genomes of millions of Balkan men. Compare the two sides of the gradient. In northern Serbia, the Slavic component can exceed 60%, while in the southern Peloponnese, it dwindles to roughly 20 to 30%. That difference of nearly 40 percentage points over a few hundred kilometers is the genetic shadow of a demographic earthquake. And it teases a deeper pattern because the gradient is not just a number, it is a fate line that will lead directly to the most uncomfortable modern truth. Reveal number 3 is what that gradient actually means when you zoom out. It means that the real genetic structure of the Balkans is not a patchwork of nations, but a gently sloping landscape. Geographic latitude explains more of the variation than any ethnic label. A surprising side fact is that this pattern makes the Balkans unusual in Europe. Many other regions show sharper genetic breaks at language frontiers or mountain ranges. Here, the mountains seem to have channeled rather than blocked gene flow. Envision a genetics postdoc in a small office, a half-drunk cup of strong coffee beside her keyboard, watching a principal component analysis plot load on her screen. The dots appear, colored by a computer according to self-identified ethnicity. Red for Serbs, blue for Croats, green for Bosniaks. She leans forward, squinting, because the colors are not separating into neat clusters. They overlap so completely that the plot looks like a single purple smear. She checks the labels, thinking the software has made an error. It has not. The two-sided number comparison here is visual. Genetic variance attributed to north-south geography is significant and measurable, while variance attributed to national identity collapses almost to zero. That smear is a silent testimony that what people call separate stalks are, under the skin, a single river with many bends. And this river carries us towards the people who speak its name. The 4th chapter brings the genetic clustering into sharp relief. When genome-wide SNP analysis places populations into a family tree, Serbs sit in a tight genetic cluster with Croats, Bosniaks, and Montenegrins. This South Slavic cluster sits genetically intermediate between Eastern European Slavic populations to the north and Southern Balkan groups such as Greeks and Bulgarians. A surprising side fact is that the genetic distance between a Serb from Belgrade and a Croat from Zagreb is often smaller than the genetic distance between a Serb from the far north of Serbia and a Serb from the far south of the same country. The national border, in blood terms, is a mirage. Walk into a sterile sample collection room at a university hospital. A gray-haired man from Novi Sad rolls up his sleeve. A younger woman from Dubrovnik does the same. Their spit samples are labeled and shipped to a central facility. Weeks later, a machine spits out 2 long strings of genetic code. When those strings are compared side by side, they match so closely that the algorithm simply labels them both South Slavic. The two sides of the comparison are stark. The genetic variation within the Serbian population is larger along its own north-south length than the average difference between Serbs and Croats. That single fact pulls the rug out from under any narrative of pure, bounded descent, and it leaves a question hanging in the air that must now be addressed directly. The 5th chapter reveal confronts an emotional claim head-on, the attempt to carve out uniquely ancient origins for one group alone. The pre-Slavic Illyrian and Thracian ancestry, that deep layer we began with, is not the property of a single modern flag. The genome data shows that this component is distributed nearly evenly across the Western Balkans, with no statistically significant excess in any one nation. A surprising side fact comes from oral tradition. In a small stone house in rural Montenegro, an elderly man reclines by the hearth and tells a visiting folklorist the story of how his forefathers were Illyrians, the first sons of the land. 4 hours drive away, across a border, another village elder tells the same core story with a different name for the tribe. The two stories cannot both be uniquely true, and the DNA suggests that the deeper truth is that they are both heirs to the same submerged continent, just wearing different costumes. The microscene is quiet. A cassette tape recorder hums on a wooden table, the elder's voice raspy with age, the fireplace smoke clinging to the wool of his jacket. The data simply shows two populations with the same 40-odd% of that ancient signal. The numbers tell no favoritism. This leads us naturally to the last and most unequivocal chapter of evidence, the one that closes the circle. The sixth and strongest reveal is the explicit conclusion of the 2023 cell study. The authors state, in plain terms, that there are no major genetic differences between Serbs and Croats as distinct national groups. The variation that exists is better explained by the north-to-south geographic gradient than by today's ethnic boundaries. This is not a political opinion, it is a population genetic measurement with a known margin of error. A surprising side fact is that this finding was not a fluke of one study. Earlier Y chromosome and autosomal surveys had pointed in the same direction for years, but they lacked the ancient DNA confirmation that finally seals the argument. Picture a classroom 30 years ago. A teacher pulls down a heavy map that shows tribal movements, large arrows colored in thick paint, each labeled with a people: Serbs, Croats, Slovenes. The children copy the arrows into their exercise books. Now overlay that map with a transparent sheet printed from the cell study. The arrows dissolve into a soft blur of color flowing continuously south. No sharp edges, no distinct lanes. The two-sided comparison is between what the textbook map implies and what the genetic gradient shows, a model of separate rivers versus a model of a single braided stream. The forward tease is almost unnecessary because the arc of evidence has converged so sharply that the core answer now stands fully lit. All the data points we have walked through, the pre-Slavic foundation, the overwhelming Slavic wave, the smooth geographic gradient, the overlapping cluster of South Slavic peoples, the shared inheritance of the ancient Balkans, and the direct absence of major national genetic boundaries, each strand pulls in the same direction. The picture is no longer a scatter of separate dots, but a single strong line. Here is the core answer, plain and without hedging. The genetic history of Serbs is not the story of a distinct ancient bloodline that separates cleanly from neighboring peoples. It is, with overwhelming scientific agreement, the story of a majority Slavic migration-era genetic input that arrived in the early medieval period and combined extensively with a pre-existing, deeply indigenous Balkan population. The modern Serbian gene pool is a blend in which both components are roughly equal, and that blend is shared almost identically across the South Slavic-speaking populations of the Western Balkans. Genetically, Serbs are not a separate branch on the human family tree. They sit within a continuous, intermingled South Slavic cluster that defies national borders entirely. And yet this answer, as decisive as it is, contains within it a twist that changes what the answer actually means. The deeper revelation is not simply that Serbs and Croats are genetically similar. It is that the entire framework of distinct ancient ethnic ancestries we were taught is, at the population level, a relatively recent layer of paint over a much older and more unified canvas. The true story is one of a single, continuously blended population stretched across the region, shaped by the same massive migration wave, and subsequently divided mainly by later political, religious, and linguistic history, rather than by deep ancestral genetic difference. The irony is so sharp it almost hurts. The very differences that have been fought over, enshrined in textbooks, and felt so intensely for generations, are biologically invisible at the population level. A 19th-century nationalist historian, searching for a pure Serbian origin, was looking for a needle that does not exist in the haystack of the genome. Instead, he was standing on a shared ground that he refused to see. The mechanism of this irony is straightforward. National identities in the Balkans crystallized during the modern era, drawing on folk memories and selective readings of medieval chronicles. The genetic data reveals that those memories, however powerful, do not reflect a biological reality of separation. The ancient bloodlines supposedly flowing in parallel were, in fact, braided together so thoroughly that no laboratory technique can pull them apart into neat national strands. So what you were taught as primordial difference is, at the cellular level, a very modern invention. This genetic conclusion does not stand alone. An entirely different category of evidence converges on the same point. Linguists have long observed that Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin form a single dialect continuum, a language macrogroup where the shift in pronunciation and vocabulary is gradual across space, not abrupt at political frontiers. The standardized languages you learn in school are, in large measure, political standardizations of a shared linguistic fabric, and the mutual intelligibility between them remains extremely high. If the populations had been truly isolated for millennia, their speech would have diverged much more dramatically. The linguistic gradient mirrors the genetic gradient with an elegance that is difficult to dismiss. Additionally, anthropological surveys of physical traits, and even some medical genetic studies searching for disease markers, have failed to find clusters that match national borders, instead reporting continuous geographic variation. This independent convergence, where genes and words and physical characteristics all tell the same story of a blended north-to-south gradient, gives the final picture a robustness that any single line of evidence alone might lack. How did this blending happen so thoroughly? The mechanism is not mysterious once you strip away the expectation of ancient purity. After the initial Slavic settlement pulse, there was never a reproductive wall between neighboring communities. The river valleys and lowlands of the Balkans served as conduits, not barriers. Over the subsequent 500 years, families moved, intermarried, traded, and shifted their dialects across the entire continuum. Religious organization later introduced cultural divisions: Catholicism in the northwest, Orthodox Christianity in the center and southeast, and Islam in parts of Bosnia. But these religious boundaries functioned as social markers, not genetic walls. They shifted marriage patterns, but they did not halt gene flow completely. From a biological standpoint, a mixed population reaps the benefit of higher genetic diversity, which can increase resilience to disease and environmental stress. The cost, if one can call it that, is simply that no one group can point to a unique, isolated genome. For a nation builder in the 19th century, that cost was an unbearable message, so it was omitted from the story. It is essential to say plainly what this evidence does and does not prove. The studies show population-level averages and gradients, not individual identities. Every single person has a unique family history, and a geneticist cannot look at a single genome and declare its owner Serbian or Croatian with any certainty. The ancestry percentages quoted are approximate, with real margins of error that vary by region and sample coverage. Some claims circulating online, particularly those that try to assign exact purity scores to individuals, are unscientific and come from non-peer-reviewed commercial ancestry tests misinterpreted. The genetic data also does not erase the cultural, linguistic, and emotional reality of national identity, which is a legitimate historical and personal phenomenon. What it does do is remove the biological foundation from any claim that these national identities reflect deep, separate ancient lineages. To bring the story back to yourself, you sit here today, perhaps far from the Balkans or deep within its heart, carrying inside your cells a library that few of your ancestors could have read. Your genome is a document written in a script of 4 chemical letters, and its pages record no national poet, no single founder, no pure ancestral line. It records a grandmother from the Danube basin in the 7th century who spoke an early Slavic tongue and buried a child with a small pottery vessel. It records a grandfather who worked a Roman latifundium in the 3rd century, speaking a local dialect of Latin, dreaming of the gods he had woven together from Illyrian and imperial forms. It records a great-grandmother who prayed in a Byzantine church, whose parents had already forgotten the old gods, and whose own daughter would one day learn the Cyrillic script. The story you were taught, with its neat arrows and distinct colors, is a modern map laid over an ancient landscape that refused to respect any line drawn on paper. Walk quietly backward through the 6 chapters, the Illyrian skeleton lifted from the earth, the Slav family around their fire, the gradient traced in a computer screen, the overlapping purple smear of brothers, the old man and his hearthside tale, the textbook map dissolving under a transparent sheet. All of them close the master open loop. The single geographic line that explains more than any border is the latitude line itself, the silent slope from north to south along which genes flowed like water for 15 centuries. The genetic history of Serbs was never a tale of isolated bloodlines standing apart. It is a story of movement, mixture, and a shared human current that refuses to stop at any flag. And now, knowing this, what story were you told about your own ancestry that might not match what the ground really holds? Tell us in the comments.